Hello, this is Matt Wilhelm from Invasive Species Action Network in Livingston, Montana. I'd like to thank you for joining me today for this lesson about riparian food webs. Now, first, let's talk about what a riparian zone or riparian area is. A riparian area or riparian zone is defined as the green, lush area that borders a creek, stream, or other water resource. And I'm using my cursor here. And you can see as the creek kind of winds through this landscape, you've got all of these trees and grasses and different types of flowers and bushes and shrubs, very diverse in plant life. And so out here in this field, basically you have one type of plant life maybe. But when you get down into here, you got all these different types of plants and trees where animals, insects, birds, amphibians, and actually the fish benefit from these too. They all thrive. Now, there's different types of riparian zones. This would be an example of an alpine or a mountain riparian zone. You can see the small creek is winding through this valley. As you go up this mountainside, it becomes less diverse. You have maybe one or two different types of evergreen trees, maybe lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, a few, maybe a couple different types of grasses. So it's not really diverse going up through here. But when you get down into the riparian zone, you've got cottonwood trees, you've got willow trees, you have different types of grasses and flowers, shrubs and bushes, just different types of things and places where animals and insects can live and thrive and feed and raise their young and hunt for their food. This is an example of a agricultural riparian zone, kind of like out in the ranch country or farm country. You've got the river, and you can see the riparian area here along the edge of the river. And once you get away from the riparian area out into here, then you just basically have one type of plant that's being grown for agricultural purposes. So again, more diversity in plants here in this area next to the river. And this picture, I think, really shows us why riparian zones are different from the surrounding environment in a desert riparian zone. Again, the creek is down on the bottom here, and you can see the green, lush, diverse area here. And then once you get even a few hundred feet outside of this riparian zone, there's very little diversity, very little plant life. So you can see here that this would be a welcome place for animals and birds, reptiles, insects to be able to thrive. And also when you have a complex or a multitude of plants, you also, when you draw in a multitude of different animals, you have really complex food webs and food chains happening in those diverse areas. So riparian zones provide a distinct welcome change in habitat to the surrounding environment in a lot of places. Variety of different types of plant life, trees, flowers, grasses, shrubs, and bushes, and many different organisms are attracted to these areas. And when you bring in lots of different types of organisms, then you have complex food chains in a very healthy environment. As far as riparian zones, a couple of key facts here. They're diverse in plant life, like we had mentioned. Now, one thing that people don't realize sometimes is that they're very key to water quality, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. One of the things that they provide are shade to help keep the waters cool. Cold water will hold more oxygen than warm water. So if you have cooler water, the water has more oxygen, and that's really healthy for the fish, for the macroinvertebrates that live there. Again, healthy food chains usually prevail in these type of environments where you have a nice, healthy riparian zone. Another thing about riparian zones is that the trees and bushes and plants, whether it's a big cottonwood tree or a single-bladed grass, the root system from those plants help to hold and stabilize the riverbank, preventing erosion. Let's talk for a minute about woody debris. And you can see here, I'll use my cursor. This is a riparian zone. We've got a creek right here, pardon me. excuse me, have a creek right here, and you can see you've got this green lush area, and then you have some fallen wooden debris. This fallen wooden or woody debris is really important habitat for smaller animals and birds and insects and reptiles and amphibians. When it falls into a river, it provides really good habitat for fish. So this fallen woody debris is really important. And as that woody debris breaks down, and as the dead leaves that fall off of that debris each autumn, or the dead grasses, and you can see over here from my cursor, there's some brown leaves and grasses from the autumn before. This picture looks like it was taken in the spring. But when these leaves and stuff break down by way of decomposers, which we'll talk about later, it becomes a very rich, nutrient-rich soil, and it helps to grow other plants in its place. So when these plants break down, forms a rich soil. The soil is healthy, helps to grow more plants, and so the whole thing keeps recycling over decades and over hundreds and even thousands of years. Here's a cross section of a riparian zone. You've got the aquatic zone right here, which is basically the width of the creek or the water resource, the stream, river. And then as soon as you leave the aquatic zone, you enter the riparian zone. Right next to the water. And then beyond that, at the back of the riparian zone is what's called the floodplain. So the floodplain in the riparian zone and the riparian zone down to the water's edge is the area that is diverse in different plants and shrubs and trees, and really helpful to the overall health of this entire ecosystem. So we talked about water health and how riparian zones help to keep the water healthy. So riparian zones are known as what's known as a biofilter. Biofilters kind of work like this. They filter out living material like plants that filter out harmful materials like pollution or nutrients from agriculture runoff and things like that. So using my cursor, I'll come up here. And we've got ourselves a rainstorm, all right? And when it rains on the land, water will run off with gradient, with the incline of the land toward water. And as it runs off with incline of the land, it runs into the riparian zone. And what happens is when it gets to where these plants are, and when it gets to where these grasses and trees are, it slows down the water and it allows the water to soak down into the ground. And with that, it takes with it those harmful pollutants and nutrients. So these riparian zones are almost like a sponge, and they help to soak up water. And in that water that's in the runoff could be nutrients that could harm the river or pollutions, and it helps to filter those things down into the ground so they never reach the water's edge. Food chains. Many of you may know what a food chain is. There's a few examples here. A food chain is basically how organisms are related to each other by the food they eat. The relationship here would be the corn eaten by the rat, and then the rat eaten by the owl. That's a pretty simple food chain. A little more complex. You got carrots, and the rabbits love to eat carrots, and then the fox will eat the rabbit, and then the lion will eat the fox. And then a five-part, even five-linked food chain, more complex. Grass. Grasshopper eats the grass. Frog will eat the grasshopper. The snake will eat the frog, and the eagle eats the snake. So these are a few examples of basic food chains. Within a food chain, you have producers, consumers, and decomposers. And we've talked about this in other presentations along the way, but let's go over it again. Producers are the starting point of the food chain, and they make their own food from sunlight. So that would be plants, whether it's a blade of grass or a big old tree. Consumers, like this beaver, rely on producers and other consumers for their survival. So an example of a consumer would be a fish, or a frog, or a dog, or a cat, or an elk, or a deer, or a moose, or a bear. Those are all consumers. Decomposers. Decomposers have a vital part in the food chain. They break down matter, which is usually dead matter like dead leaf matter, dead grass, dead animal matter, animal waste matter. They break that down so that the nutrients can be absorbed back into the soil. And those include worms, insects, bacteria, fungus, mold, slugs, and other things. So producers, they make their own energy from sunlight, and producers are, or they make their own food from sunlight, and they are key to the riparian zone because riparian zone is made up of green plant life. So they're really important for riparian health. They provide food for consumers and decomposers. They provide habitat for multitudes of organisms, both in the water and out of the water. They prevent erosion. And like I said before, they form a biofilter, these producers do, to help keep our water resources clean. Moving on to consumers. Going to expand on consumers here a little bit. There's a few different levels of consumer. Many consumers are what's considered a primary consumer, like this grasshopper. A secondary consumer could be this bluebird, which would eat a grasshopper. A tertiary consumer would be the snake, which could eat the bird or the grasshopper. And then you've got your apex predator, which is kind of the top of that food chain. The apex predator, if it chooses, could eat the snake, the bird, or the grasshopper. And let's just say that this owl dies. And when it falls to the ground, decomposers will help to break down that dead organic matter of the owl and return its nutrients into the soil where it helps to grow more grasses. Decomposers, they digest dead plant matter and put nutrients back into the soil, just like the owl example on the slide before. Bacteria, fungus, worms, some other animals like vultures are decomposers. Anyway, help to return dead matter, whether it's plant or animal matter, back into nutrients for a healthy soil. Now, food webs are a little bit different than food chains. Within an ecosystem, a lot of food chains will overlap one another, and these overlapping food chains form a food web. In a food web, every insect, plant, animal, fish, bird plays a significant role. This picture kind of shows us what a food web is. I'll use my cursor here. You've got some grass, and the rabbit eats the grass, and then the fox eats the rabbit. All right. But also, I suppose if we wanted to have an arrow going from the kestrel to the kestrel could eat the rabbit too, or the owl could eat the rabbit. The vole could eat the grass, and the fox could eat the vole. The kestrel could eat the vole. The owl could eat the vole. Same thing with the mouse. The mouse could be preyed upon by many different animals within the food chain or within the food web. So basically, you've got overlinking food chains here forming a food web. Excuse me. Let's talk about more about food webs and food chains and use Yellowstone National Park, especially Yellowstone Lake as the focus. Yellowstone Lake is an interesting focus because it's been a very intact ecosystem for a very, very, very long time. And within the last 30 years, there's been challenges presented to Yellowstone Lake in the form of introduced fish called lake trout that are not native there. The cutthroat trout the Yellowstone cutthroat trout are the native trout species to Yellowstone Lake. And I'll use my cursor to kind of trace Yellowstone Lake here. There's the west arm, and then back over here to the east end and around. Yellowstone cutthroat trout are the native trout species here. And within the state of Montana, they are a species of concern. Their numbers are down, and there's special fishing regulations in most places where you can't keep Yellowstone cutthroat trout because their numbers are so limited. No matter what happened with Yellowstone cutthroat trout, it was always thought that they would have a safe haven here because of these waterfalls. These waterfalls are significant barriers that won't allow passage of non-native fish upstream into Yellowstone Lake. So these populations of Yellowstone cutthroat trout were isolated from invasive fish, non-native fish, and things that could hurt their population. But what happened in about 35 or 40 years ago, lake trout were, illegally introduced into Yellowstone Lake. A lot of people, it's believed it was done through bucket biology, where someone will take a bunch of fish, put them in a bucket or container, and transport them to another water body and dump them in. Highly illegal to do something like this. And what happened was, because of this lake trout illegal introduction, it really put the whole food web at peril. These lake trout, one lake trout can consume up to 40 cutthroats per year. This lake trout population has the potential to decimate the entire Yellowstone cutthroat trout population within our lifetime. Because of this factor of the cutthroat trout population in peril, lake trout are now removed every fall through a removal effort of netting and all sorts of different types of removal methods, which we'll talk about later. And about 300,000 lake trout are killed and removed and killed from Yellowstone Lake annually to try to keep that cutthroat population intact. Now, the reason why the lake trout are so bad is because they're not a good substitute for cutthroat trout within the food web. They don't make themselves available as food because lake trout like to live in deep water. And, they're not accessible to ospreys and eagles and grizzly bears and otters and the animals that feed upon fish within this particular food web. The cutthroat trout, on the other hand, do make themselves available. They live in the lake, but when it's time for them to spawn, to reproduce, what they do is that they swim into the tributary creeks like Clear Creek, and they migrate up into these small, shallow creeks to spawn. And when they do that, they make themselves available to bears, osprey, otter, eagle. Pretty much anything that'll eat meat can get an easy fish dinner during the spawning season for cutthroat trout in June and July. Pelican Creek is another really popular spawning creek where tens of thousands of cutthroat trout would migrate up. Same with Clear Creek, which is right here. And now, some back when 15, 20 years ago, they were seeing only maybe 100 or 200 migrating cutthroat because of the lake trout infestation and eating all the cutthroat trout. So the Yellowstone cutthroat trout's importance to the food web, they make themselves available to predators when they make their spawning migration. And you can see in this picture here, these cutthroat trout are Yellowstone cutthroat trout. They're in a shallow creek. And if you were a grizzly bear or an otter or an osprey or a bobcat or a wolf, you could get yourself a pretty easy fish dinner by pouncing on these spawning fish right here. They're easy prey to predators during this time. And the predators that the different species that have been preying on these fish have been doing so for thousands and thousands of years. And they've been teaching their young how to do it. And over the last, 20 years or so, it's become a struggle for that food source. And within an environment where every calorie consumed is very important to survival. 16 different species of animal and bird rely on Yellowstone cutthroat trout as a food source. So what's being done? In this picture right here, this is the National Park Service. They have caught a bunch of lake trout, which they have killed, and they're dumping them back into the water to let their nutrients to have them sink back to the bottom and have decomposers return their nutrients back into the lake. So in order to keep the cutthroat population healthy, they have instituted keep or kill rules. If you catch a lake trout on Yellowstone Lake, you have to keep it or kill it. Now, keep in mind that's not the same rule for all of the lakes in the area, just the special management rule on Yellowstone Lake. They've been monitoring the cutthroat tributaries, and what they're seeing is that through this removal program over the last 15 years or so, that the Yellowstone cutthroat trout have started to come back a little bit. So their populations are coming back, not to what they were, but they are coming back. Pardon me. So to recap, riparian food webs are very diverse in plant life. They're great habitat for animals, insects, birds and fish, amphibians and reptiles. They're drawn to these areas because of the abundance of different types of food and shelter and safety, place to raise their young. And this creates complex food chains and eventually food webs. Riparian food webs or riparian areas, act as biofilters to help filter harmful nutrients and um, pollutions out of the water. And the root systems help to stabilize the stream bank, preventing erosion. So now it's time for Creativity Corner. If you click on the link below, you will find some really fun activities that deal with riparian food webs, and we invite you to check those out. So for the entire staff of Invasive Species Action Network, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, this discussion of riparian food webs. So if you'd like to learn more about invasive species or to find more lessons like this, please go to stopais.org. Invasive Species Action Network is concerned with the human-caused spread of invasive species. We ask everyone to clean, drain, and dry your gear after each use when you're out recreating to help stop the spread of invasive species. Again, thank you very much. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next time.